key kind of factor in Roman conquest was that their conquest was driven by economic factors. It was driven by wanting to expand the economy, expand you know the population and military might and stuff. But if there was a land that they saw that they had to fight over and it wasn't worth keeping, they wouldn't sell it. They wouldn't conquer it. Like it's if it was an economically unviable thing to do, they wouldn't do it. So the
Yeah.
extent that they expanded to at the peak was the extent of land in which they actually felt was worthwhile. So we obviously always talk about when it comes to talking about the decline of Rome and the decline of empires, it's this notion that they stretch themselves too thin. They get a bit too greedy, a bit too ahead of themselves in terms of trying to conquer and conquer and conquer. But I think with Rome, it's interesting because the more they expanded, the less Rome centric the empire became.
Yeah.
So what I mean by this is that obviously at the start we always look at Rome and we think of an empire as like one country that conquers other places and takes all their resources and brings them all home, right?
Hmm.
Where I think it starts getting interesting is that Rome obviously expanded to such an extent that they controlled land in Britain, they controlled land in Africa, they controlled land in the Balkans, all those other areas, right? They were very far away from each other. The transport that they had at the time didn't allow them to really move things very quickly. I think there's one of the mentions in the book is that the price of grain would double every 50 miles if you tried to trade it within the Roman Empire.
Oh wow, that's interesting. An interesting stat.
Which is crazy when you consider, like, obviously even Italy itself is quite a big place. So the fact that like the trade would still be really expensive from one end of Italy to the other, I think is also quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, it shows the kind of extent to which localism is a factor pre globalization, pre kind of. I mean, you could say the Silk Road is the start of globalization, but pre kind of modern industrialized globalization, should we say that little communities are that's the whole world in that area. So to reach out, to reach beyond is a massive step in the way that we don't even think about now, because we can order something from far afield and it arrives with us sort of within a week. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting point. And actually, over time, you had obviously Rome grew to a massive extent, and when it reached the kind of peak of its territorial expansion, there's obviously then a disconnect between the inner empire and kind of like Rome and its immediate region, and then the outer empire, which is obviously very far away logistically from the inner empire. So a lot of these regions are developed by Rome. Rome goes in, they implement their own ways of government and military and agriculture, all these things. The people who do these things in the local regions, they're not just Roman people who just up and leave one day and no one knows what to do anymore. They're teaching the local people how to do these Roman things. So over time, Germanic tribes were trading, they were trading goods with Rome that Rome couldn't get before. For instance, I mean, there's some documented evidence that Germanic confederations and tribes, obviously, they traded amber from the Baltic region with Mediterranean kind of settlements and Rome as well, because to Romans and Greeks and other like kind of Mediterranean civilizations, they saw amber as a very valuable and precious thing for jewelry because it was something that they couldn't get hold of.
Well, quite, yeah.
So again, that's something that they traded with the Romans that they couldn't get before. So it benefits both sides to have this relationship. But through doing this, Rome is in the complacent position of the empire, which thinks that no one can ever challenge them because they beat them militarily. They have a larger economy, and to a certain degree, that's true. They're never going to take over in the current state of affairs. However, the more that these other peripheral entities start developing, They figure out how to, the blacksmiths figure out how to make Roman quality weapons.
Yeah.
They can suddenly temper steel better than they could before. They can make better shields than they did before. And suddenly the soldiers are trained better than they were like 10, 20, 30 years ago. All gets to the point.
It's the old,
you go.
I was going to say it's the old student becomes the master thing. It's Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader.
Yeah.
It's they're gonna. It's eventually, if you teach them too well, they're going to turn on you and off you.
Well, that's the thing, because again, like I won't cover too much of like, the demise of kind of the Western Roman Empire on this episode, but like that kind of is how it ended. I mean, over time, the confederations grew; they got more powerful, more influential, more organized, and then eventually, as Western Rome itself was kind of facing a lot of economic turmoil, political turmoil, was really failing to kind of exert influence over its regions anymore. All it took was a couple of great leaders on the Germanic side to exploit that and to start taking territory away from Rome and to start asserting their own dominance. So I think that was quite interesting, and then that's kind of like the Roman section of that part of, which I was reading about, and then the parallel it draws is obviously we've already kind of mentioned it with the British Empire in India, because one of the things that was meant the book mentions, and one of the things we talked about, was how obviously logistically, how can you compare Rome to the British Empire and the difference in technology? We had railways, we had different forms of transport that were much more efficient and quicker, and this spans the entire world. The whole world was covered pretty much. The sun never sets on the British Empire and so on.
Yeah.
But in context, when you look at comparatively, what the extent of the Roman Empire represented geographically at that time in history, that was the whole world. So obviously their transport and logistics took way longer because of the technology that they had at the time. But when you compare the two, when you think, okay, right, well, it took 6 months to sail to Australia from the UK or something like that.
Yeah.
Is it really proportionally that different in terms of the scale? You still have logistics going from one side of the known world to the other. So is it that different, really? I'm not too sure.
Yeah. Even the kind of wonders of industrialization don't speed it up to the extent that we now have. I mean, I suppose technology in that sense, i.e. boats, boats aren't, they're going to be quicker because they got, engines now in the 19th century when they didn't, in antiquity. But, in antiquity they had galley slaves who were a pretty powerful engine themselves. So in terms of that technology, there's a shift in the technology, but there's not a massive shift in the actual sort of time frames that you're dealing with. As you say, proportionally speaking, obviously there's some, but not as much as you might expect. Whereas obviously now it's a totally different story.
But yeah, I mean.